September 2, 1945. Tokyo Bay **** on the USS Missouri's deck, the world's strongest navy watched. General Douglas MacArthur stepped to the mic. Behind him, at attention, stood a man who looked like he'd crawled from his own grave. His uniform hung loose, his cheeks sunken, his eyes deep-set. But he stood tall, still. Who was this man facing surrender? Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. Just 3 years prior, he was the one holding the white flag. Papers called him the general who lost the Philippines. History's largest American force surrender. Some called him a failure. Others, far worse. Yet here he was, on the Missouri's deck, watching Japan concede. How did he get here? His story began not on a battleship. It started in a jungle. On the Bataan Peninsula, 80,000 men were starving, sick, cut off. And one general refused to abandon them. What was it like in 1941? The Philippines looked like the end of the world. Hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck Clark Field, America's main air base. Most B-17s never took flight. Caught on the runway, fueled and ready. In one afternoon, MacArthur lost half his air force. Just like that. Gone. Then came the ships. On December 22, General Homa landed 43,000 troops. Lingayen Gulf, with 80 warships backing them. MacArthur's defenders were outnumbered, outgunned. And now, without air cover. MacArthur ordered a retreat to Bataan. The plan: dig in, hold, and await U.S. reinforcements. The men truly believed help was coming. They had to believe it. It was the only thing that made sense. But one man in Washington knew the truth. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall saw the math. Europe first. The Pacific could wait. The Philippines, and its 80,000 men, were expendable. The men on the ground never knew. Into this stepped Major General Jonathan Wainwright. A West Point cavalryman, class of '06. Lean, leathery, built like a fence post. His men called him Skinny, with affection. He was one of them. While MacArthur directed from Corregidor's tunnels, Wainwright was on the front lines. He walked defenses before sunrise. He sat in the dirt with men who hadn't eaten well. Where was Wainwright? Wherever it was worst, an officer said. By January's first week, Bataan men were on half rations. Not poor planning, but chaos. MacArthur left huge supply stockpiles behind. On the wrong side of the Japanese line. Tons of food, just out of reach. So they made do. Monkey, snake, iguana. Whatever the jungle offered. Even their cavalry horses were slaughtered. And they kept fighting, believing help was coming. Wainwright saw these men daily. He knew what Washington decided. And he made a choice that defined him. He would stay. He would fight. And not leave one man behind. 6 weeks of jungle heat. 6 weeks of one meal a day. 6 weeks of an empty horizon. Then the radio started its nightly broadcast. Japanese broadcasters played one song, directly to the men. What was the song's title? I'm waiting for ships that never come in. Night after night. A cruel reminder. The men knew. No one was coming. Then came March 11th, MacArthur was leaving. By order of President Roosevelt, he'd lead the counteroffensive. The Philippines would have to hold alone. MacArthur met Wainwright before he left. Goodbye, Jonathan, MacArthur said. When I get back, if you're still on Bataan, I'll make you a lieutenant general. Wainwright didn't flinch. I'll be on Bataan, he replied, "if I'm still alive." At dark, MacArthur slipped away by torpedo boat. Through Japanese-controlled waters, in a stormy sea. 4 days later, he landed in Australia. And spoke words the world would remember, "I have come through, and I shall return." Back on Bataan, the men heard it on the radio. Some felt let down, even betrayed. "We could have held," one wrote, "if supplied." Wainwright didn't write letters like that. He'd just been given command of a hopeless situation. No reinforcements, no resupply, no air cover. Nothing getting through the blockade. Just the men in front of him, still fighting. He cabled Washington, "My men will be starved unless food arrives before April 15th, Washington received it. Washington did not reply. Wainwright folded the cable, then returned to the line. What was fighting on Bataan like? Pounds within a single month. Some managed to shed 25. By the end of March, the soldiers were no longer losing any more weight. There was simply nothing left on their bodies to lose. The harsh jungle provided whatever sustenance it could. Monkey meat, prepared by boiling and salting, snake, iguana, various roots, essentially anything they could manage to catch, prepare, and consume. The cavalry's own horses were the very last to go. These were animals the soldiers had bonded with over years, carefully feeding them by hand, grooming them, even giving them names. General Wainwright himself gave the difficult order. The horses were then handed over to the quartermaster's department. Slaughtered for food, the men consumed them without complaint, as there was absolutely nothing else available. Then, the illnesses began to take hold. Malaria struck first, followed by dengue fever, then dysentery, and finally beriberi, a severe malnutrition disease that causes extreme swelling in a man's legs, making walking nearly impossible and severely impacting the heart. The field hospitals had completely run out of quinine by February. Without quinine, malaria doesn't just make you feel unwell. It relentlessly returns, cycle after cycle. A soldier might be on the front lines in the morning, developing a fever by the afternoon, and be back in action by the next dawn, simply because there was absolutely no one available to take his place. Surgeons had to operate using only flashlights. Lacking sufficient anesthesia, men were forced to bite down on leather straps while the doctors worked on them. By March, disease was claiming more lives on Bataan than Japanese bullets were, yet still, they persisted in fighting. Every single morning, Jonathan Wainwright was right there alongside them, not confined to an office, but out in the thick of it, wading through the mud, personally inspecting defensive positions and sitting with soldiers who had gone 2 days without sleep. One of his officers later summarized it quite simply, "His mere presence on the front lines, that's what truly kept our spirits up. It wasn't about orders or speeches, it was just about him being there with us." On Good Friday, April 3, 1942, the Japanese forces launched their final major offensive. General Hama had patiently waited for weeks for additional troops to arrive from Japan. Now they were present, comprising fresh soldiers, heavy artillery, and well-fed troops, facing men who had survived on just one bowl of rice daily for the past 3 months. The cold, hard logic of the situation was inescapable. Wainwright committed every available reserve he possessed. It proved insufficient. Day after day, the Japanese advanced southward. On the morning of April 9, Major General Edward King made a critical decision. Without notifying Wainwright, without seeking any approval, he surveyed his 75,000 men, weakened by illness, broken in spirit, completely out of ammunition and vital medicine, and he made the only truly humane choice available. He sent a message to the Japanese commanders. Bataan was officially surrendering. This marked the largest surrender of American forces in the entirety of history. Wainwright learned of this news from his position on Corregidor. He later wrote that a profound silence seemed to descend upon Bataan that fateful morning. He could sense it clearly from his vantage point across the water. However, the conflict was far from over. Situated just 1 mile off the coast of Bataan, strategically positioned at the entrance of Manila Bay, lay a small, heavily fortified island known as Corregidor, and Jonathan Wainwright remained on its soil. Corregidor itself was a mere 2 square miles of rugged rock and reinforced concrete, strategically located at the mouth of Manila Bay. The Japanese forces referred to it as the stopper in the bottle. As long as this island remained under American control, they couldn't effectively utilize the Pacific's premier deep-water harbor. They desperately needed this harbor, and they were determined to seize it. Following the fall of Bataan, every single Japanese artillery piece on the peninsula was relentlessly turned towards the island. Constant bombardment came from artillery, bombers, and mortars, operating around the clock. The soldiers endured life underground within the Malinta Tunnel, a complex network of concrete passages carved directly into the rock. Hundreds of soldiers, nurses, and support staff lived, slept, and struggled to breathe air thick with the sense of smoke, antiseptic, and pervasive fear. The lights would flicker erratically with each incoming impact. The very walls would tremble. Dust rained down from the ceiling, much like snow. Anything above ground, no structure could withstand the assault for long. Buildings crumbled. Gun emplacements were buried beneath piles of debris. Soldiers would dash between positions with their heads down, desperately counting the seconds between each incoming shell burst. Wainwright continuously moved through this harrowing environment, transitioning from the tunnels to the surface and back again, personally inspecting the defensive guns. Engaging in conversations with the troops, projecting an image of unwavering confidence that this island would hold, regardless of his personal convictions, which he kept private. On May 1, he transmitted a crucial radio message to President Roosevelt. He composed it in the straightforward manner of a soldier, devoid of any emotional embellishment, focusing solely on the stark facts. He stated, "There is a limit to human endurance, and that point has long since been passed." He wasn't seeking pity, he was delivering a clear, concise, and final medical diagnosis of the situation. 4 days later, on May 5, the Japanese forces commenced their amphibious assault. Under the cover of darkness, just before midnight, landing craft began pushing through the choppy waters towards Corregidor's shores. The American and Filipino defenders were ready, despite their exhaustion and severe lack of resources. They met those incoming landing craft with every ounce of strength they had left. The initial wave of Japanese soldiers suffered incredibly high casualties. Bodies were seen floating in the water, and boats were engulfed in flames. For a few hours, it seemed genuinely possible that the island might successfully repel the assault. Ultimately, it did not. Additional waves of enemy boats kept arriving. Then more followed. The Japanese possessed an overwhelming abundance of manpower they could afford to expend. The American forces, however, did not. By the morning of May 6, Japanese tanks were advancing inland across the island. Wainwright made one final walkthrough of the tunnel. He surveyed the remaining survivors. Wounded soldiers lay on stretchers lining the tunnel walls. Dedicated nurses continued their work in the dim, flickering light. Soldiers who had been fighting for 4 months with virtually no adequate sustenance. He ultimately made his decision. He dispatched 2 officers forward, carrying a white flag. He then chose to face the Japanese himself. He would not delegate that deeply personal and difficult task to anyone else. Wainwright surrendered Corregidor at precisely 1:30 in the afternoon. He did so to halt the ongoing bloodshed. He was acutely aware of what captivity under Japanese control would entail. He made this choice because the men within that tunnel had already given every last thing a person possibly can, and he refused to demand even one more sacrifice from them. Before the Japanese could fully establish their control, American soldiers worked with extreme haste throughout the tunnel. Vital code books were immediately fed into fires, and classified documents were meticulously burned. The regimental colors, the proud flags that had flown over American positions since December, were forcefully torn from their poles and deliberately set ablaze. No Japanese soldier would ever be allowed to capture them. Wainwright stood and watched as the flags consumed by flames. He was fully aware of how the world would likely perceive his actions. He knew the single word that would be used to describe it. Surrender. He was prepared to accept that label. What he absolutely could not tolerate, what was never even a remote possibility, was walking out of that tunnel and abandoning those men to face certain slaughter. The Japanese military moved Wainwright through a series of POW camps. The Japanese authorities transferred Wainwright between several different POW camps. First in the Philippines, then on to Taiwan. Next, he was moved to a remote camp in Manchuria, deep in the frozen north of China under Japanese occupation. He was the highest-ranking American prisoner of war throughout the entire conflict. Yet, this title meant nothing. He had no private quarters and received no special treatment. He stood in the same lines as everyone else, ate the same meager soup, and slept on identical wooden planks. His weight dropped steadily until the man who once stood lean and tall weighed around 125 pounds, his bones barely covered by his uniform. Inside the prison camp, he bartered everything he owned, his pens, his wristwatch, anything he had, for any scrap of information about MacArthur's progress. He had no idea if any of it was helping. He didn't know about Midway. He didn't know about Guadalcanal. He was unaware of the island-hopping campaign slowly advancing toward Japan. He held on to just one certainty. He was still alive. And as long as he was drawing breath, he was still a soldier serving in the United States Army. That was enough to keep him going. It simply had to be. The men in that camp later recounted that Wainwright's presence was what sustained them. It wasn't because he delivered inspiring speeches. It wasn't because he had all the answers. It was simply because each morning, he was there, standing tall, present, refusing to give up. He would call the men to attention. He maintained formations, enforced discipline, and upheld the routines of military life. This wasn't because regulations strictly demanded it. It was because he understood something the guards failed to grasp. The moment you cease acting like a soldier, you cease being one. And if these men stopped being soldiers, they would have nothing left to hold on to. For 3 years and 3 months, Wainwright persevered. Waking up each morning and making the choice, once more, to stand on his feet. The soldiers who returned home from those camps carried a profound experience with them for the remainder of their lives. Some would share their stories, most chose not to. If you had a family member who served in the Pacific Theater, whether in the Army, Navy, Marines, or Army Air Corps, please share their name in the comments, along with their service branch and where they served. The stories of these brave men are fading from our memory much faster than we tend to realize. Let's not let that happen. Here's a crucial point that history books often don't highlight. The defense of Bataan wasn't just a military setback. Bataan was a critical exchange. Japan had given General Homa a tight deadline of 50 days to conquer the Philippines. Just 50 days. After that, his troops were scheduled to redeploy south, pushing through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands towards Australia. That was the intended plan. It was meant to be a swift, decisive, and unstoppable campaign. However, it ended up taking 150 days. Consider what transpired during those extra 100 days. In June of 1942, while Wainwright was already imprisoned, the United States Navy engaged the Japanese fleet near a small island known as Midway. For Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. In a single day, the backbone of Japanese naval air power was decisively broken. Yet, the victory at Midway was only possible because the Navy had the necessary time to prepare, to reposition its forces, and crucially, to break Japanese naval codes to set the trap. That invaluable time was bought on Bataan, earned through the agony of men biting down on leather straps in field hospitals and by soldiers manning their posts with legs too weak to support them. Following Midway, the campaign moved to Guadalcanal. After Guadalcanal, the arduous journey back began, with battles at Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, and Iwo Jima, each one a step closer to reaching Japan. None of these subsequent events would have unfolded on the same timeline if the Philippines had fallen within 50 days. If Homa's forces had redeployed south as scheduled, if Australia had faced an attack before it was ready, while historians continue to debate hypothetical scenarios, one fact remains undisputed: the defense of Bataan and Corregidor delayed the entire Japanese timetable in the Southwest Pacific by a full 100 days. These 100 days provided the rest of the Allied world the opportunity to fight back. Wainwright had no awareness of any of this from his prison camp in Manchuria. He couldn't possibly know what the suffering of his men had made achievable. He simply continued to wake up each morning, calling his men to attention, holding on in the only way that remained available to him. In August of 1945, the war finally concluded. Soviet forces, advancing into Manchuria, reached Wainwright's prison compound. American intelligence agents had managed to locate him just days earlier. He was finally free. For the first time in 3 years and 3 months, he was a free man. On August 31, Wainwright was transported to the new Grand Hotel in Yokohama to meet with General MacArthur. MacArthur entered the room. He saw Wainwright, his hair now white, his face gaunt, his body supported by a cane. MacArthur paused. He recognized the cane. It was the same one he had gifted Wainwright before the war, originally intended as a swagger stick, a symbol of his high rank. For 3 long years, Wainwright had relied on it simply to stand upright. MacArthur was overcome with emotion and could not speak. The two men embraced. 2 days later, on September 2, 1945, Wainwright was assisted aboard the USS Missouri. As he stepped onto the deck, he managed to stand tall. The Japanese delegation arrived at 9 in the morning. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, and General Yamizu, Chief of the Army General Staff, these were the men who had directed the war across the entire Pacific theater. They signed the surrender documents first. Then MacArthur approached the table, and standing directly behind him, close enough to reach out and place a hand on his shoulder, was Jonathan Wainwright. MacArthur affixed his signature using 6 different pens. When he finished, he turned and presented 2 of those pens to the individual standing behind him. One went to British General Percival, who had been forced to surrender Singapore. The other was given to Wainwright. The very man who had surrendered the Philippines was handed a pen that symbolized the acceptance of Japan's surrender. There are historical photographs capturing that very moment. Wainwright is depicted looking down at the document laid out on the table. His expression remains unreadable. But his eyes held the look of a man who had long anticipated something he wasn't sure he'd ever witness. He had waited for this moment for a very, very long time. Just 8 days later, President Harry Truman invited Wainwright to the White House. He personally presented him with the Medal of Honor. The official citation stated, in part, that he displayed exceptional courage and decisive leadership against overwhelming enemy forces. He repeatedly risked his own life, going far beyond the call of duty. Wainwright frequently visited the front lines, right there with his troops. His presence offered the vital example and motivation that made their incredible efforts possible. On September 13, New York City held a massive ticker tape parade in his honor. Countless people lined the streets, cheering for the very general who newspapers had once labeled the general who lost the Philippines. He officially retired from the Army in 1947. Wainwright passed away on September 2, 1953. This was precisely 8 years to the day after Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The soldiers who fought their last battles on Bataan and Corregidor are in their late 90s today. Soon, there won't be anyone left to share those experiences. You won't find anyone to sit with you and describe the oppressive air in that tunnel, or the feeling of surviving on a single bowl of food for 3 months straight. Imagine still having the strength to pick up a rifle after all that. Or hearing a song on the radio, ships that never come in, and deciding it didn't matter. You chose to stay. Jonathan Wainwright stayed. His men stayed with him. Their immense suffering bought something vital for the world. Something that was later cashed in at battles like Midway, Guadalcanal, and ultimately, on the deck of the USS Missouri in September 1945. If your father or grandfather served in that war, perhaps in the Army, Navy, Marines, or Army Air Corps, please share his name and story in the comments below. Include his unit and where he served. Let's hear his tale.